Previously on Saving Asia, we talked about the science behind climate change and the injustice around its impacts across the world. In this episode, we'll be shedding light on what it means to fight for climate justice. What does it demand from all of us? Hello everyone, I'm Christine Sabilio, a journalist and advocate, and this is Saving Asia. So for this episode, we're again joined by students from Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Guys, you remember the first episode where we had Lourdes Tibig, a climate scientist, and we were really overwhelmed by the wealth of knowledge she shared with us on the science of climate change and the need for climate action. For this episode, do you have any expectations for our panel today?
For this episode, I would like to learn more about the different actions and solutions that we can do as a collective society for collective action in solving climate change. I would also like to learn more about how we can eradicate the fear that most environmental activists feel when it comes to speaking up for what they believe in and for speaking up for Mother Earth.
What I would want is that I would love to learn about climate justice from each and every experts here, because they have the knowledge and also that with their knowledges we can then do something based on their recommendation and what they have taught us.
Thank you so much, Yong. Who wants to go next?
I still don't know how to make the society do, and I hope I can get it from here.
Jocelyn or Kristen?
In today's episode, I'd like to find out more about how we can approach the intersectional issues within the climate action so that we can make better informed decisions, and we can also help to uplift the vulnerable communities, especially those who are affected by climate action at the forefront, like people who live in areas of the world that are really impacted by drought or flooding right now.
Thank you. And finally, Tristan.
I want to learn more about climate change, also the solutions, especially for the youth, so it can make our world and our earth better.
So thank you again for the questions of our students. As always, it's been insightful, and I'm excited to learn the answers to some of their questions in our panel discussion. We are fortunate that we have three experts and advocates of climate for this episode. Joining us is Atty. Tony Viña, Associate Director of Policy and International Relations of the Manila Observatory. He was also the former lead negotiator for the Philippines in the climate negotiations. Also with us, Tiza Mafira, Associate Director of Climate Policy Initiative in Indonesia. And we're also joined by Nithi Nesadurai, Director and Regional Coordinator of Climate Action Network Southeast Asia. Hello and welcome to the program.
Hello.
Very
Hi,
nice
Christine.
to have you. Yeah. So I guess let's get to the point immediately. You know, in our last episode, we were talking about the science of climate change and what the youth can do. I think, and being environmentally conscious is somehow trendy right now as well. And there are people who try and do their part, you know, in their own small little way. But why is it that individual action is not enough? Why is it that we need collective action to really make a change?
I agree with the premise that small individual steps, such as taking the initiative to reduce our carbon footprint, such as reducing the amount of electricity and water we consume, the amount of meat we eat, it's important because it shows our personal commitment towards addressing climate change. Yet at the same time, it cannot match what governments and corporations can do because of the resources they have at their disposal. They have the ability, with the stroke of a pen, to make decisions which can save tons of carbon emissions. Examples of these include making a decision to decarbonize the economy of a country or to adopt a circular economy in the manufacturing process, which will have exponential benefit.
Thank you, Nithi. Tony?
Climate change is a global problem and therefore requires a global solution. Individual actions and community actions are good, but they do not add up to the change that we need, the systematic change that we need. Political action is important substantially because of actions by a few corporations, what we call the carbon majors. Individual actions will not stop those carbon actions. They can only be stopped through collective action.
Climate change is caused by emissions, and emissions, the majority of emissions are the responsibility of the oil companies, the coal companies, the electricity generation companies that continue to use fossil fuels, and the transportation companies. And now that there are alternatives to fossil fuels, the fossil fuel companies are trying to hold on to their industry in many ways, and governments are supporting them by providing them with subsidies, all kinds of support that props up this industry that's supposed to be dead. As individuals, it's difficult for us to change that situation, right? That has to happen with collective effort, demanding for a system, an ecosystem that gives us those options.
We mentioned global action and collective action. So maybe if you're going to explain it to the youth right now, how are we all interconnected? We learned in the first episode that the climate change has different impacts on regions and countries, and there are some countries with more responsibility, right? So why is it important for on the national level, on a global level, the global north and the global south to all work together or to address this global problem of climate change?
No one is safe until all of us are safe, simply because climate change doesn't occur in a silo. So emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, which lead to climate change, which happen in one part of the world, affect those in another part of the world who have contributed the least to the problem. Now, if you look at the impacts of climate change and see what has already happened, we've had the loss of homes and climate-induced migration. We've had loss of livelihoods. We've had loss of agricultural productivity. We've had loss of food security, and we've had loss of biodiversity. Now, when you look at who's been impacted the most, you find that the most vulnerable communities who have contributed to the least to climate change are the ones which have to suffer the greatest impacts. This is a clear explanation of climate injustice. Addressing climate change has to happen at all levels. And when you look at it from a climate justice perspective, you have to take the perspectives of ethics, gender, human rights, equity, youth, indigenous peoples, and those who are vulnerable, and not just simply from the lens of economy and politics. It has to take place from the local level to the national level to the global levels, with the goals to mitigate against climate change, that is, reduce carbon emissions and compensate for loss and damage for those already suffering the impacts of climate change, and help all to build resilience against climate change. When taking a climate justice approach, an equity and fair share model has to be applied.
Especially you mentioned the intersectionalities, one of the things that our students were asking about. For this portion, we're going to talk about the collective actions that we've done already. Tony, you're one of the lead negotiators previously for the Philippines, and I remember I was covering the Paris climate negotiations then, and you were our go-to guy. Can you talk more about that? What has agreed upon in the Paris Climate Accords, and what is happening now so far? Have the countries been following on their pledges?
The essence of the Paris Agreement was to try to get the world on the right track for climate change on all the various areas we've discussed so far. On mitigation, to make sure that we don't go beyond 2 degrees, preferably not beyond 1.5 degrees, to have climate finance and climate technology transfer happen, to create a loss and damage mechanism so that countries, poor countries, communities, individuals would have a resort if with deaths and damage of property and infrastructure because of climate change. So it's a fairly ambitious agenda. All the countries adopted it, and we actually felt that the agreement was not the best possible. I certainly wanted a bigger commitment for money to help developing countries. But we also knew that it wasn't the minimum. It was much more than the minimum. Not the maximum, but the maximum possible at the time. The last 5 years has been basically crafting the rules for that agreement. Delayed a bit because of the pandemic and also because of the Trump administration that took the US away out of the process. But when Biden was elected, he brought back the US. So we are now at a stage where countries have been giving their nationally determined contributions. That's the targets that individual countries have to make. So we're not there. We have a good framework for the agreement, but we're not there in terms of the ambition, in terms of the money. There's a lot of work that has to be done. Now the ambition has to be 1.5. That's very clear since 2018. And the window to do that is very small. So here's the thing. We can only get there if a very strong political pressure is put on governments to do the right thing.
Tony mentioned global targets, national targets. How about for Nithi and Tiza? Are there other forms of collective action as well? And perhaps you would want to share something that's being done in the region or in your country?
Collective action for me requires external pressure as well as internal change makers. In Indonesia, for example, yeah, sure, there's lots of initiatives. I mean, the government has announced targets to reduce emissions by 2030, targets to reduce emissions, to reach net zero emissions by 2060. And then there's other targets such as commitments to not build new coal power plants after 2025. Those commitments would not have happened without advisors working from the inside, lobbyists or advocates working, to help the government, use evidence-based policymaking to make those commitments, as well as external pressure from NGOs, from civil society, from youth groups. Now that there are commitments, the work is not done, right? We still need to, as a society, collectively monitor whether those commitments are being fulfilled or not. There's a lot of collective work that needs to be done.
Tony explained the history of the Paris Agreement, in historic landmark agreement 2015, something which happens at the global level, and provides a framework for countries to act at the national level. And yet, at the same time, we have to recognize that action really takes place at the national level. If we really want to see impacts and changes throughout the world on climate change, it's what individual governments take and what actions they take, what kind of political will they put behind addressing climate change. And one initiative which took place in Malaysia was this the formation of something known as the Climate Emergency Group, Gabungan Darurat Iklim. And this grew organically, basically when we felt our government wasn't doing enough. A group came up with a paper to make Malaysia carbon neutral by 2023. At that discussion, it was suggested that while we look at this tactical target, why don't we also look at a long-term strategy? And that mobilized everyone who was present at the meeting to form this climate emergency group, which now has more than 100 individuals representing more than 60 organizations, and they are driven by youth. I have never seen such a dynamic group, and they're responding to everything we, on a minute-by-minute basis, on a day-by-day basis, and providing input to our government. This group, which was just formed a few months ago, it's very dynamic, and it's the youth who are driving it, and it's very exciting.
Thank you, Nithi. I'm sure it's very inspiring for the students listening to us to hear about that. Maybe I can go back to Tony and Tiza. In your respective countries, are you seeing any signs of hope like this? Any collective action that might be helpful in our long-term fight against climate change?
The Youth for Climate Action groups here are quite quite active. I mean, we coordinate actions for renewable energy and various groups and seen how effective that can be. After years and years of struggle, we finally got the Department of Energy, for example, to at least have a moratorium on new coal-fired power plants. And it's really a product of political action. We've gotten our banks to pay attention. It's very important as well because financing for fossil fuel projects are still happening. Banks still find it profitable, and we really have to push them back on that. And I also have to say that the Philippine government, after hiatus from international action for a few years, is back in action and advocating with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, climate justice with developed countries. And the Philippine government is quite clear about its climate justice perspective at the global level.
Thanks, Tony. Tiza, for Indonesia, is it the same as Malaysia and the Philippines? Is the government doing anything? Are there local youth groups as well?
There are local youth groups. There are, networks of civil society organizations that have long fought for climate issues. We have no difficulty finding new recruits because the youth are always interested. I mean, Indonesia is a dynamic democracy, but lately it has been less inclusive actually in its policy making. It's been more of an objectified statement, like we support the youth, we support the CSOs, but it hasn't really been a process whereby our opinions have been absorbed into policy. And I mean, that was an inspiring story from Malaysia. I think having this group that's always on, always ready to a response to a new government statement, new government policy, and have an intelligent response to it, have like a constructive response to it. That would be something ideal, I think, that we're trying to work on achieving as well here in Indonesia. There's no lack of potential for that. It's just that we kind of need to knock on the door a bit harder.
The students also expressed this overwhelming feeling, I guess, of like, how will you tackle such a big global crisis like climate change? The one interesting question that we received is that, how long will this fight last? These are just young people and they're already worrying about the future of their children, if there's going to be a future for the next generation. We only have like a few decades until we see the really bad effects of climate change. What can you tell to the youth who are interested in joining the fight against climate change?
This is an intergenerational fight because even if we solve this particular challenge now and cap increase of temperature at 1.5, which we can still do if we fight hard enough, that's gonna stretch for generations. So the answer is no, there is no end in the sense of after this, we go home and sleep. But there is an end in the sense that we need to transfer it to the next generation. In other words, you don't have to be always doing this for the rest of your life. If we actually succeed, for example, in the next 10 years and limit increases to 1.5, then I would have the confidence to completely leave the scene and just leave it to the next generation to deal with new challenges. There'll always be new challenges. But the key is to leave something better. It's not fair for the next generation to receive a problem without any tools, without any experience, without any wisdom for them to use to deal with that problem. It's a way of making sure that there will be another generation that will catch the ball.
I interact with youth a lot. And when they come and they get involved, they bring in a certain level of dynamism, energy, innovation, especially on their skills with social media. So they have so much to contribute. And if we want to achieve climate justice, if we want to address climate change in a substantial and significant manner, we must create the political will, because ultimately government decisions are in response to pressure from the people. very important for the youth to come in and build up the critical mass, which will create the political will for our governments to decarbonize our economies. It's always this narrative that, oh, addressing climate change it's going to affect the economy. It requires so much sacrifice and pain. And this false narrative has to be changed because ultimately, bringing in measures and policies to address climate change is actually good for the economy. Energy efficiency, energy conservation. Where's the suffering? You save money at the end of the day while reducing your carbon footprint. So the youth are very good in creating all these kind of messages, getting their attention, putting it on social media. So be hopeful and get involved.
Very good point, Nithi. Renewable energy will actually address a lot of the problems we have when it comes to electricity, like in the Philippines. Tiza, you have something to share as well?
Well, I'm a millennial, and I'm thinking of voting out any leader who isn't fully on board with the agenda of decarbonization and shutting down coal plants. And my hope is that my entire generation, as well as the Generation Z, which will also soon become voters, have the same idea. If you care about climate change, it doesn't mean that all of your peers care about climate change. There's actually research about this. I can speak for Indonesia, where there's been research how the urban youth are more likely to understand climate change rather than the rural youth. But the rural youth are more likely to understand its consequences, although they don't call it climate change, right? They call it drought or a harvest, a crop failure. So it's really important to understand your peers, so that when you communicate with the rest of your peers, you communicate with an agenda to have them, your entire generation, fully on board with the climate change issue, whatever you want to call it, whether you want to call it crop failures or or forest fires. And make sure that the time comes to vote, the politician that you vote for is fully on board with this climate change agenda and has very explicit talking points on how they're going to tackle this issue. I think that is something that is potentially very powerful. That's massive action, and it could be very decisive.
Thanks, Tiza. That's a very good reminder to make climate change one of the hot topics for the elections. Like the Philippines will be having it next year. It should be, at the center of the discussion. Unfortunately, it has not been the case in the past elections. I'm sure for other countries, your countries as well. Your answers also overlap with our next question. How do we make others more involved in the fight for climate change? You're correct that the youth know how to best communicate with their peers. How will you convince these other people who might not know what to do or how to act or how to even begin?
I want to introduce a term here that's quite important: just transition. One reason why it's been difficult to get other sectors, other groups to move is because it scares them on what climate action would mean for their livelihoods, for their interest. And to be honest, those of us in the climate community have not done a good job. We just think, okay, close this down, close that down, change this, but we haven't done a good job of what are the alternatives, what are the livelihoods. So I've actually started working on that, prioritize that, because it's actually also not right to tell people to change and then not have alternatives for them, especially people that are poor, people that are that have livelihoods and are limited to that. So most of Southeast Asia, there's not a lot of climate denial because we experience it a lot. So what we have instead is justifying inaction because of poverty.
Yes, definitely serving alternatives, right? For those who will lose their jobs if we close down all this oil, fossil fuel power plants. I'm curious also about the education sector. Do you think there could be some reforms there that would allow the next generation to be more informed about climate change?
Definitely in the education sector, it should be mainstreamed within the curriculum. And I think To a certain extent, it has happened in Europe, and that's why we see a very active youth rising in Europe. I agree that there's not much climate denialism in this hemisphere, but there's also not much of a consistent understanding of what it really is, of what climate change really is either. There's some pockets of ignorance, I would say, even though it's already being felt. As you know, disasters are becoming more frequent, but it may not be tied to this global phenomenon of climate change, and it may not be necessarily tied to emissions, right? And so we really do need to tie it to emissions, make it clear that this is man-made, this is not, well, this is fossil fuel made, corporate made, to be exact. Point out the root cause, which is the amount of fossil fuel emissions that industries around the world continue to churn out on a daily basis.
Nithi?
I agree with what Tiza has just said, that climate change has to be mainstreamed into the formal education process, right from, for me, from kindergarten or nursery all the way to graduate study, where it's got to be a compulsory core component. You don't want it to become something which you have to study and get a grade on. So there also has to be that interaction with civil society coming in and giving the additional dimension, giving the real life dimensions to what they're studying in a textbook. So that's my input on the education side. With regard to converting the unconverted, what we are doing in Climate Action Network is we're having a campaign called The World We Want, Impacts Campaign, which is actually bringing out videos of people affected on the ground, getting down to the ground, talking and documenting in very short videos the farmers, how their life has been turned around through climate change, the indigenous people living in the forests, vulnerable communities, and how their life is changing, and bringing that out to show, to bring about the sense of urgency to address adaptation, loss, and damage. We also have to present that alternative, positive a scenario of a climate neutral world, with renewable energy, with energy efficiency, with low carbon mobility, or even non-motorized transport such as cycling and walking, creating the positive picture, the alternative scenario, which ultimately has shown in many studies is going to be good for the economy. This may be a way to bring about greater awareness amongst those who may not take this very seriously or who are not interested.
Thanks, Nithi. Definitely in media, at least there's a trend already on solutions journalism, right? Perhaps for our last question, what can you say to the youth? Some final words?
For my final point of advice to the youth is our small individual steps matter. So what I would recommend to the youth is to measure your ecological footprint. And the reason for this is very simple. It's by going through the calculator process and filling it up and getting your ecological footprint score, you get to understand the diversity of issues which actually contribute towards climate change and living within the ecological limits of one planet.
This is a problem or a challenge that needs knowledge, that needs science, that needs creative ideas. You can't just solve this problem by conjuring a solution right there and there. I call it going ahead of the problem and solve it before it even gets there.
It's very important, therefore, to have a positive vision of what you want the world to look like in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years. Yes, it is important to know that we're heading towards a very uncomfortable world, that we're heading close, very, very, very close to disaster. It's easy to get lost in depression and in a sense of helplessness when you focus on that fact. It's also equally important to have a vision of what the world could actually be if we take collective action. If you focus on that goal, I think we'll be able to reach it, together. And it's a beautiful goal. I mean, just imagine cities powered by 100% renewable energy, cities where each building has its own, rooftop garden, where big parks where forests are still abundant and our waters are clean and our air is clean. That is a beautiful vision to have. And personally, it's what keeps me going. So I hope that you all have that kind of vision, stay in your heart and your brain as you work through this.
That's the best way to end our panel discussion. Thank you so much, Tiza, Nithi, Tony, for your very insightful messages and advice for our youth. For this part of the discussion, we'll go back to our student panel and see what they have to say and what they have learned from you guys.
First of all, I would like to say that I'm very, very thankful for this opportunity and for having the three of them with us here, where they shared their very powerful insights and shared with us new knowledge about the environment. But at the same time, it also saddens me that we still have to pressure the government. We still have to pressure the bigger corporations. It's really saddening to know that without us pressuring them or without us speaking up, they wouldn't do anything about it. This is a continuous fight.
Thank you, Patricia. Anyone else would like to volunteer next?
I kind of agree to each and every of their what they said just now. Like for Nithi, he mentioned like social media is kind of like a powerful tool for Gen Z or for us youngsters when it comes to spreading awareness. And also I feel like other than social medias, maybe you can do something more Gen Z-ish, like for example, games or maybe stories or maybe some music or something, which to gain more awareness.
I'd like to go next. All of these information are so overwhelming, but yet it's really hopeful because they have done so much part. Like the older generation have done so much to pass on this legacy for us to continue to take action and drive even bigger and better changes. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Can we have from Jilan or Tristan?
I learned a lot today from the expert that whoever we are, however old are we, from whatever background we are, we can make the world better by voicing the climate justice that experts have previously discussed, by starting with individual actions and then building a team and voice this out to the world. And the point is, as long as we have the ambitions to make this climate justice possible, to fight for climate justice, then we can. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristan.
For this episode, I learned that the thing we can do is work together. In Japanese, we have a proverb, becek ketite olo ketoro. Tumindak becek. We look like a little point if we do it individually. The bad thing, or tumindak olo, we look like a big thing even if it's just a small bad. Therefore, we should unite the little point and make something big together. I realize it's not about Indonesia or Malaysia or Philippines or other countries' problem. It's about our future, and there is no one with that responsibility but us to make a move to solve this problem through climate justice.
Thank you to our students for enriching our discussion. Not only did we learn from Tony, Tiza, and Nithi about the intergenerational fight against climate change and what we can do about it, but we've heard these young voices that is really inspiring us to hope for a better future. And that's it for this episode, but here's what we have for you next.
It has created so much problem to access to water.
At 3 in the morning, I have been hearing the loud cry of children, of elderlies.
We are fighting this good fight because the people deserve better. Stand for a world that is more just, where we care for each other and care for nature.
I'm Christine Sabillo. Thank you for listening. We hope this episode inspires you to take action to save not just Asia, but our planet. Join our community of climate advocates through Climate Tracker Asia's WhatsApp group or by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Join us for another insightful discussion next time on Saving Asia.